By the time White House Farm was declared a solved case, the questions had already begun, not loudly, not immediately, but with the quiet persistence of something unfinished. This is not a story about what happened on that August night in 1985. This is a story about what was accepted, what was overlooked, and what was decided before all the evidence had been properly examined. It's about a system that needed an answer, found one that seemed to fit, and moved on before realizing that convenience and truth are not always the same thing. In the rural countryside of Essex, England, far from the noise of London and the scrutiny of national attention, a farmhouse stood isolated among fields that stretched toward the horizon. White House Farm. The name itself carried a certain weight, a sense of establishment and permanence. It was the kind of place where generations had lived and worked, where the land meant something more than property, where family history was measured not in years, but in decades. By most accounts, it was a picture of English rural prosperity, the sort of place that appeared in postcards and inspired a particular kind of nostalgia. But on the morning of August 7th, 1985, White House Farm became something else entirely. It became a crime scene. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the story was straightforward. Tragic, certainly. Disturbing, without question. But straightforward nonetheless. The initial reports were clear. 5 people were dead. A family wiped out in a single night. The victims included Neville Bamber, aged 61, a respected farmer who had spent his life working the land. His wife, June Bamber, aged 61 as well, known in the community as a devout woman with strong religious convictions. Their daughter, Sheila Caffell, 28 years old, a former model whose life had been marked by struggles with mental health. And Sheila's twin sons, Nicholas and Daniel, just 6 years old. 5 lives ended in the early hours of the morning, inside a house that should have been safe. The police arrived, the scene was examined, and within hours, a narrative began to take shape. It was a narrative that made sense to those who needed it to make sense. Sheila Caffell, the troubled daughter, had suffered a psychotic break. She had killed her parents, killed her children, and then turned the gun on herself. A family annihilated by mental illness. A tragedy, yes, but one with an explanation, one with a clear beginning, middle, and end. The case was effectively closed before it had properly opened. There would be an inquest, of course. Procedures would be followed, but the essential story had been written. And for many that was enough. After all, wasn't it obvious? Hadn't Sheila been struggling? Hadn't there been signs? The pieces seemed to fit together with uncomfortable ease. But here's the thing about stories that fit together too easily. Sometimes they're true, and sometimes they're just tidy. Sometimes a narrative is accepted not because it's been proven, but because it's useful, because it allows people to move on, because it doesn't require uncomfortable questions or prolonged investigations, because it protects reputations, preserves order, and maintains the illusion that the world makes sense. White House Farm should have been a closed chapter, but it wasn't. Not really. Because even as the official version took hold, there were whispers, small doubts, inconsistencies that didn't quite add up, details that seemed out of place. And slowly, methodically, those whispers grew louder. What started as a simple case of family tragedy became something far more complex. A case that would expose flaws in police work, reveal uncomfortable truths about how quickly institutions can settle on convenient explanations, and ultimately force a reckoning with the very nature of truth itself. If this was really so clear, people began to ask, why did it take years to stop arguing? Why were there so many questions? And why did the answers keep changing? This is the story of White House Farm. Not the story you think you know, but the story beneath it. The story of what happens when Certainty is manufactured when evidence is interpreted through the lens of convenience, and when the pursuit of truth becomes secondary to the need for closure. It's a story that begins not with violence, but with a family. And to understand what happened that night, you first need to understand what White House Farm was before it became a crime scene. White House Farm sat in the village of Tolleshunt, Darcy, a small community where everyone knew everyone, where gossip travelled faster than news, and where a family's reputation mattered. The Bambers were not just residents, they were pillars. Neville and June Bamber had built their lives around the farm, pouring decades of work into the land, raising their children in a world that moved slowly and deliberately. The farm itself was substantial, over 300 acres, producing crops that sustained not just the family, but contributed to the local economy. It was a working farm, yes, but it was also a symbol of stability, of tradition, of a way of life that seemed immune to the chaos of modernity. Neville Bamber was known as a practical man, someone who understood the rhythms of rural life, who could fix machinery and negotiate with suppliers and make the kinds of decisions that kept a farm running year after year. He was respected in the community, the kind of person others turned to for advice. June, his wife, was different in temperament, but no less influential. She was deeply religious, involved with the local church, committed to a life guided by faith and principle. Together, they represented a certain kind of English respectability, the sort that came not from wealth alone, but from consistency, from being known, from being trusted. But families are never as simple as they appear from the outside. Beneath the surface of White House Farm, there were tensions. Not the kind that drew public attention, not dramatic conflicts that people gossiped about, but the quieter, more pervasive kind. The kind that exist in nearly every family but rarely get acknowledged until something forces them into the open. Neville and June had adopted 2 children, Jeremy and Sheila, bringing them into the family as infants. Jeremy, the older of the 2, had grown into a young man who seemed eager to escape the confines of rural life. He enjoyed the city, the social scene, the idea of a life beyond the farm. Sheila, on the other hand, had followed a different path entirely. She had been beautiful, striking enough to work as a model, but her life had been marked by instability. 2 failed marriages, struggles with mental health, periods of darkness that worried her parents deeply. There was also the matter of inheritance. White House Farm was worth a considerable sum. The land, the property, the assets, accumulated over a lifetime of work. Neville and June had made provisions, as any responsible parents would, but provisions can create expectations, and expectations, especially around money, can complicate relationships in ways that are difficult to articulate. Jeremy had always been interested in the farm's value, in what it could provide, in what it represented for his future. Sheila, by contrast, seemed less concerned with material matters, more focused on her children, on trying to build some semblance of stability in her own life. Nothing about White House Farm suggested collapse, not to outsiders anyway. It was a family with problems, certainly, but what family doesn't have problems? It was a household with tensions, but those tensions seemed manageable, containable, until they weren't. The night of August 6th, 1985, was unremarkable in most respects. Summer in Essex. Warm but not oppressive. The kind of night where windows stayed open and the sounds of the countryside drifted through the darkness. Neville and June were at the farm, as they always were. Sheila was visiting with her sons, staying in one of the upstairs bedrooms. It was a regular visit, and the kind that happened periodically. Nothing unusual about it. Jeremy was not at the farm that night. He was at his cottage a few miles away, a detail that would later become significant, but at the time seemed entirely ordinary. As far as anyone knew, it was a quiet evening, a normal night in a normal household. And then, in the early hours of the morning, everything changed. At approximately 3:20 a.m., the police received a phone call. The caller was Jeremy Bamber. His voice, according to the officers who took the call, sounded distressed, urgent. He told them that his father had just phoned him, that Neville had said something about Sheila going crazy, that there was trouble at the farm. Jeremy claimed he had tried to call back, but got no answer. The police responded. Officers were dispatched to White House Farm, arriving in the darkness, uncertain of what they would find. When they reached the property, the house was silent. No sounds of struggle, no signs of immediate danger. But the doors were locked. The windows were secure. They couldn't get inside. They waited. They called for backup. They established a perimeter. And as the sun began to rise, they made the decision to enter. What they found inside White House Farm would become the subject of intense scrutiny, analysis, and debate for years to come. But in that moment, in the immediate aftermath of discovery, it seemed clear enough. Neville Bamber was found downstairs in the kitchen. He had been shot multiple times. His injuries were severe, evidence of a violent struggle. June Bamber was upstairs in the main bedroom, also shot, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had been attacked while in bed. In another bedroom, Sheila Caffell lay across the bed, a rifle beside her. She had been shot twice, once in the throat and once under the chin. And in the smallest bedroom, Nicholas and Daniel, the 6-year-old twins, were found dead, each shot multiple times. 5 bodies, a rifle, a house locked from the inside. The scene, as the initial investigators saw it, told a story. The rifle belonged to Neville. It was a semi-automatic weapon kept at the farm for pest control, a common enough thing in rural England. The fact that it was found near Sheila seemed significant. The fact that the house was locked from the inside seemed to rule out an external intruder. And the fact that Sheila had a documented history of mental health struggles provided what seemed like a motive, or at least an explanation. She had snapped. She had killed her family. She had killed herself. It was horrific, yes, but it made a certain kind of sense. The kind of sense that allows a case to be processed, categorized, and moved through the system. The police conducted their initial investigation. They photographed the scene. They collected evidence. They interviewed Jeremy, who told them about his father's phone call, about the distress in Neville's voice, about his own horror at what had happened. And within a matter of days, the conclusion was reached. This was a murder-suicide. Sheila Caffell was responsible. Case closed. But not everyone was convinced. Not immediately, and certainly not as time went on, because even in those first days there were details that didn't quite fit. Small things. The kind of things that might be dismissed as irrelevant in the rush to reach a conclusion. The kind of things that, when examined more closely, start to look less like irrelevant details and more like evidence of something else entirely. It wasn't that the explanation was proven, it was that it was useful. And usefulness, in the world of police investigations and public narratives, can be more powerful than truth. The explanation offered to the public was straightforward, almost comforting in its simplicity. Sheila Caffell had been unwell. She had suffered from mental health issues for years, depression, possible schizophrenia, periods of instability that had required hospitalization. She had been on medication, though there were questions about whether she had been taking it consistently. Her parents had been worried about her, concerned about her ability to care for her children. There had even been discussions about the boys living at the farm permanently, about Sheila receiving more intensive treatment. In the narrative that took hold, these facts were arranged into a linear story. Sheila's mental state had deteriorated. She had become paranoid, perhaps delusional, and in a moment of psychosis, she had committed an unspeakable act. She had killed her sleeping children, she had killed her parents, and then, overcome by what she had done, she had turned the gun on herself. This version of events had several things going for it. First, it required no external perpetrator, no mysterious intruder, no complicated conspiracy. It was self-contained. Second, it aligned with existing prejudices and fears about mental illness. The idea that someone could snap, could become unrecognizable to themselves and others, was frightening but also familiar. It had precedent. It had been seen before. And third, it allowed everyone involved to move on. The police could close the case. The community could process their grief. The system could function as it was designed to function. But there was a problem. The problem was that not all of the evidence supported this tidy conclusion, and some of the evidence actively contradicted it. Consider the rifle. It was a semi-automatic weapon, yes, but it was also cumbersome, long, heavy, difficult to maneuver in close quarters. Sheila Caffell was a small woman, slight in build, not particularly strong. The idea that she had wielded this weapon with enough control and accuracy to kill 4 people, some of whom were shot multiple times, seemed improbable to those who understood firearms. But it was possible. Difficult, but possible. Then there was the matter of the struggle. Neville Bamber had not died quickly. He had been shot multiple times, and his injuries suggested he had fought back. There were defensive wounds, evidence that he had moved through the house, perhaps trying to reach a phone, perhaps trying to stop his attacker. The scene in the kitchen showed signs of a violent confrontation. Furniture disturbed, blood on the floor. The question was, if Sheila had been the attacker, why were there no signs of injury on her? No scratches, no bruises. No evidence that she had been in a physical struggle with a man twice her size who was fighting for his life. And then there was the matter of the silencer. In the days following the initial investigation, a member of Sheila's family found something in the gun cupboard at White House Farm. A silencer. It had been returned to the cupboard, carefully placed among other items. But here's the critical detail. The silencer had blood inside it. Blood and fragments of material consistent with what would be expected if it had been used during the shootings. This was significant. Extraordinarily significant. Because if the silencer had been used during the crime, then it had been removed from the rifle and returned to the cupboard afterward, which meant that whoever had committed the murders had cleaned up, had taken the time to disassemble the weapon, store part of it away, and lock the house from the inside before leaving. This did not fit the profile of someone in the throes of a psychotic episode. This suggested premeditation, planning, control. But these concerns were not immediately given the weight they deserved. Why? Because the narrative had already been established, the case had been labeled as solved. And once a case is solved, once a conclusion has been reached and announced, there is institutional resistance to reopening it. Admitting that the initial investigation was flawed would mean admitting that mistakes were made. It would mean acknowledging that evidence was overlooked or misinterpreted. It would mean, in essence, that the system had failed. And systems are designed to protect themselves, not maliciously necessarily, but instinctively. They prefer continuity over correction. They prefer certainty over ambiguity. And so the questions about the silencer, about the lack of injuries on Sheila, about the logistics of the crime were initially dismissed. They were explained away. They were categorized as unfortunate but ultimately irrelevant complications in an otherwise clear case. At this point, it's worth considering the role that money plays in stories like this. Not as the sole explanation for everything that happened, but as a factor that shapes motivations, influences behavior, and complicates relationships in profound ways. White House Farm was not just a home, it was an asset, a significant one, worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, possibly more, depending on market conditions and future development potential. Neville and June Bamber had worked their entire lives to build this wealth, and they had every intention of passing it on to their children. But inheritance is rarely simple. It involves decisions about who gets what, when they get it, and under what conditions. And those decisions, even when made with the best intentions, can create resentment, jealousy, and conflict. Jeremy Bamber stood to inherit a substantial sum upon the death of his parents. Sheila would have inherited as well, but her circumstances were different. She was struggling, she had children to care for, she was dependent in many ways on her parents' support. And there had been discussions in the months leading up to the murders about changing the terms of the inheritance, about ensuring that if anything happened to Neville and June, the farm would be protected, that it would be managed responsibly, that it wouldn't simply be sold off or squandered. These were practical concerns, the kind that any responsible estate planning would address. But they were also concerns that had implications. If Sheila and her children were removed from the equation, Jeremy would inherit everything: the farm, the money, the future. This is not to say that money was the only factor. It never is. But when money is involved, certainty becomes expensive, questions become threatening, and the incentive to accept a convenient narrative becomes much stronger. In the weeks following the murders, as the official version of events solidified, there were people who remained unconvinced. Relatives, friends, people who had known Sheila and couldn't reconcile the woman they remembered with the person she was now being portrayed as. They spoke up, they raised questions, they pointed to inconsistencies. But their concerns were met with a familiar response. Grief, they were told, can cloud judgment. Families, in the wake of tragedy, often struggle to accept difficult truths. Mental illness is unpredictable. Just because you knew someone one way doesn't mean you knew everything about them. These were not unreasonable responses in themselves, but they had the effect of shutting down inquiry, of framing doubt as denial, of making it seem as though those who questioned the official story were simply unable to cope with reality. And yet the questions persisted. Quietly at first, then with growing insistence. Because the more people looked at the evidence, the more they examined the details, the more it became clear that something was wrong. Not just questionable, not just ambiguous, wrong. The second story, the one that would eventually emerge and overturn everything that had been accepted, didn't appear all at once. It developed slowly, piece by piece, as people began to look more carefully at what had been dismissed or ignored. It started with the silencer. That blood-stained silencer that had been found in the gun cupboard, that had been noted but not given sufficient attention. A family member, Sheila's cousin Christine Eaton, became convinced that the silencer was proof that the official story couldn't be true. She pushed for further investigation. She contacted journalists. She wrote letters. She refused to let the matter rest. And, slowly, reluctantly, the authorities began to pay attention. Then there was Jeremy Bamber's behavior. In the days and weeks after the murders, he did not act like someone in mourning. He seemed, to those who observed him, strangely detached, almost cheerful at times. He attended the funerals, yes, but he also went out to nightclubs. He spent money freely. He talked about the inheritance, about what he would do with the farm, about his plans for the future. To some, this was simply a manifestation of shock, a way of coping with unbearable grief. But to others, it seemed like something else. It seemed like relief, like the behavior of someone who had gotten what they wanted. And as people began to compare notes, to share their observations and suspicions, a different picture began to form. A picture in which Sheila was not the killer, but a victim. A picture in which someone else had committed these murders, staged the scene to look like a murder-suicide, and walked away while the police drew the wrong conclusion. The breakthrough came when Jeremy's former girlfriend, Julie Mugford, went to the police. She told them that Jeremy had confessed to her, that he had planned the murders, that he had talked about killing his parents for the inheritance, that he had described in chilling detail how he would do it, how he would make it look like Sheila was responsible, how he would ensure that no one suspected him. Her testimony was explosive. It contradicted everything the police had concluded. It suggested that the entire investigation had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. But it also raised new questions. Why was Julie coming forward now? What was her motivation? Could she be trusted? The police faced a choice. They could dismiss her claims, continue with the existing narrative, and risk being proven wrong later. Or they could reopen the investigation, admit that mistakes had been made, and pursue the possibility that they had been deceived. It was not an easy decision, but ultimately they chose the latter. As the investigation was reopened, the evidence began to be examined with fresh eyes, and what had once seemed like a straightforward case now looked like a carefully constructed lie. The blood-stained silencer, far from being an irrelevant detail, became central to the prosecution's case. If the silencer had been used during the murders, then it had been removed afterward. And if it had been removed afterward, then the crime could not have been a spontaneous act of violence. It had been planned. The lack of injuries on Sheila, previously explained away as unimportant, now became evidence that she could not have been in a physical struggle with her father. The logistics of the crime, the way the bodies were positioned, the timing of events, all of it was reanalyzed. And the more closely it was examined, the more it pointed away from Sheila and toward Jeremy. There were other pieces of evidence as well, small things that had been overlooked or dismissed, but now took on new significance. Phone records that didn't quite match Jeremy's account of when his father had called him. Witness statements that contradicted his timeline. Physical evidence at the scene that suggested more than one person might have been involved, or at least that the crime had not unfolded the way the police had initially believed. None of this evidence was conclusive on its own, but taken together it formed a pattern that suggested Jeremy Bamber had murdered his family, staged the scene to implicate his sister, and then reported the crime to police, playing the role of the devastated son. It was a theory that required believing that someone could be that calculating, that cold-blooded. But the evidence supported it, and ultimately that evidence would be presented in court. The system that had so quickly accepted the first explanation now had to reckon with the possibility that it had been wrong. And this was not just about one case. It was about how cases are investigated, how evidence is interpreted, how conclusions are reached. It was about the dangers of premature certainty, of allowing convenience to override thoroughness. Changing the story meant admitting the system had chosen convenience. It meant acknowledging that institutional pressure to close cases, to provide answers, to move on, had resulted in a failure of justice. And that acknowledgement, while necessary, was deeply uncomfortable. Because if the system had failed here, where else had it failed? How many other cases had been resolved too quickly, with too little scrutiny? These were questions that extended far beyond White House Farm, but White House Farm had become the test case, the example that would force a reckoning. In October 1986, more than a year after the murders, Jeremy Bamber was arrested and charged with 5 counts of murder. The trial began the following year, in October 1987. It was one of the most closely watched trials in recent British history, not just because of the nature of the crimes, but because of what it represented. This was not just a criminal trial. It was a trial of the investigative process itself. The prosecution's case rested on several pillars. The blood-stained silencer, which they argued, proved premeditation. Julie Mugford's testimony, in which she described Jeremy's confessions and his plans. The lack of physical evidence supporting the murder-suicide theory. The presence of evidence that contradicted Jeremy's account of events. And perhaps most importantly, the argument that Jeremy had the strongest motive. He stood to inherit everything if his parents and sister were dead. The the farm, the money, the freedom to live his life as he chose. The defense, for their part, attempted to discredit Julie Mugford, suggesting she was a scorned ex-girlfriend seeking revenge. They pointed to Sheila's mental health history, arguing that she was indeed capable of such violence. They challenged the reliability of the forensic evidence, suggesting that the investigation had been so badly bungled in the early days that it was impossible to know what really happened. But the prosecution had one advantage: they had time to build their case, time to examine the evidence carefully, time to construct a narrative that, while more complicated than the original story, was also more consistent with the facts. And as the trial progressed, as witness after witness took the stand, as evidence was presented and arguments made, the weight of that narrative became increasingly difficult to ignore. The trial was not just about what happened, it was about who to believe. Was Julie Mugford telling the truth, or was she fabricating a story out of bitterness? Was the forensic evidence reliable, or had it been contaminated by a flawed investigation? Could Jeremy Bamber really have done this, or was he being made a scapegoat for a crime that had no satisfying explanation? These were not easy questions. The jury deliberated for more than 10 hours, and when they returned, they delivered a verdict: guilty. Guilty on all 5 counts of murder. Jeremy Bamber was sentenced to life in prison with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. Later, that recommendation would be changed to a whole life tariff, meaning he would never be released. But even with the verdict, the discomfort remained. Because the trial had revealed uncomfortable truths about the justice system, about how investigations are conducted, about how easily the wrong conclusion can be reached when convenience is prioritized over rigor. The verdict meant that someone had been held accountable, but it didn't erase the fact that for more than a year the wrong story had been accepted. It didn't change the fact that if certain people had not been persistent, if they had not refused to accept the official narrative, Jeremy Bamber might never have been charged. And it didn't answer the deeper question: how many other cases had been closed too quickly? How many other convenient explanations had been accepted without sufficient scrutiny? Public reaction to the verdict was mixed. Many people felt relief. The system had corrected itself eventually. Justice had been served, even if belatedly. But others felt anger at the initial investigation, anger at the rush to judgment, anger at the way Sheila had been portrayed, first as a murderer, then as a victim, her reputation manipulated to serve whatever narrative was most convenient at the time. And there were those who remained unconvinced, who believed that the case against Jeremy Bamber, while compelling, was still circumstantial in crucial ways, who argued that reasonable doubt remained even after the trial. These debates continue even now, because the difference between legal truth and historical truth is not always clear. The law provides a verdict, a final answer, a resolution, but history is messier. History accommodates doubt, ambiguity, the recognition that we may never know with absolute certainty what happened in that farmhouse. What we do know is this: White House Farm became a symbol, not just of a crime, but of systemic failure, of what happens when investigations prioritize closure over accuracy, of the dangers inherent in accepting the first plausible explanation without rigorously testing it against all available evidence. The case forced changes in how murder investigations are conducted, in how evidence is preserved and analyzed, in how quickly conclusions can be drawn. It became a teaching tool, a cautionary tale, a reminder that the pursuit of truth requires patience, skepticism, and a willingness to challenge initial assumptions. White House Farm didn't fail because no one looked. It failed because people stopped looking. Because once a story was in place, once a narrative had been constructed, there was institutional momentum behind it. Momentum that made it difficult, though not impossible, to change course. The lessons from White House Farm extend beyond police work. They touch on something fundamental about how we process information, how we construct meaning from chaos, how we decide what to believe. Human beings crave certainty. We want answers. We want to understand why terrible things happen. And when we're offered an explanation that seems to make sense, that fits with what we already believe about the world, we're often too willing to accept it without sufficient scrutiny. This is not a failing unique to police investigators or journalists or the general public. It's a cognitive bias that affects all of us. We see patterns where none exist. We confirm our pre-existing beliefs. We dismiss information that contradicts what we've already decided is true. And in cases like White House Farm, these tendencies can have devastating consequences. Consider how the initial narrative took hold. Sheila Caffell had mental health issues. There was documentation of this. There were hospital records, medication prescriptions, witness statements about her struggles. When the bodies were discovered, when the scene suggested a family annihilation, it was natural, perhaps even inevitable, that investigators would connect those dots. Here was a woman with a history of instability. Here was a crime that seemed to fit the profile of someone experiencing a psychotic break. The conclusion wrote itself. But what was missing from this analysis was rigorous skepticism. What was missing was the question that should always be asked in any investigation. What if we're wrong? What evidence would contradict this theory? What alternative explanations exist? These questions were not asked, or if they were asked, they were not given sufficient weight. And as a result, the investigation locked into a single track early on, and alternative possibilities were never seriously explored until it was almost too late. This is not to say that the initial investigators were malicious or incompetent. They were operating under significant pressure. A family had been wiped out. The community was in shock. The media was demanding answers. There was institutional pressure to provide those answers quickly, to restore a sense of order, to demonstrate that the police were in control of the situation. In that context, a theory that seemed to explain everything, that required no further investigation, that allowed the case to be closed, must have seemed like a gift. But it was a poisoned gift, because in accepting it, the investigators stopped asking questions. They stopped testing their assumptions. They stopped looking for evidence that might contradict their conclusion. And in doing so, they very nearly allowed a murderer to go free. Jeremy Bamber's defense throughout the trial and in the years since has maintained his innocence. He has argued that the evidence against him was circumstantial, that Julie Mugford's testimony was unreliable, that the forensic evidence was ambiguous at best. He has claimed that he is the victim of a miscarriage of justice, that he was convicted not because the evidence proved his guilt beyond reasonable doubt, but because the prosecution constructed a compelling narrative, and the jury was swayed by emotion rather than facts. These arguments have found some support, primarily among those who are skeptical of the criminal justice system more broadly, who point to other cases where innocent people have been wrongly convicted, but the weight of evidence, as assessed by the jury, by appellate courts, and by numerous reviews over the decades, has consistently pointed in the same direction, toward guilt, toward the conclusion that Jeremy Bamber murdered his family for money and then attempted to frame his sister for the crime. What makes the case so disturbing is not just the brutality of the murders, though that is certainly disturbing enough. It's the calculation involved. If the prosecution's version of events is correct, then Jeremy Bamber planned these killings. He thought through how to stage the scene. He considered how to deflect suspicion. He called the police and played the role of the concerned son. He attended the funerals and accepted condolences. He talked about his grief while simultaneously discussing his inheritance plans. This requires a level of emotional detachment that most people find incomprehensible, and yet it is not without precedent. History is full of cases where people have killed for money, where familial bonds have been severed by greed, where the lure of wealth has overcome any sense of moral restraint. White House Farm is simply one more example in a long and depressing catalogue. But what sets White House Farm apart is the way it was nearly dismissed. The way the initial investigation almost succeeded in closing the case with the wrong conclusion. If Christine Eaton had not persisted, if Julie Mugford had not come forward, if journalists had not started asking questions, if any one of several factors had been different, Jeremy Bamber might have inherited the farm, lived out his life in comfort, and the truth would have remained buried. That proximity to injustice, that sense of how close the system came to failing completely, is what gives the case its enduring power. It's a reminder that truth does not automatically surface, that justice is not inevitable, that the systems we rely on to uncover wrongdoing are fallible, sometimes catastrophically so. In the years since the trial, there have been numerous attempts to appeal the conviction. Jeremy Bamber has exhausted most of his legal options, though he continues to maintain his innocence. There have been books written about the case, documentaries produced, television dramas created. Each retelling examines the evidence from a slightly different angle, each asks slightly different questions. But the essential story remains the same. A family destroyed, a system that initially failed, a truth that was almost lost, and a verdict that, while legally final, continues to be debated. Because that's the nature of cases like this. They don't offer the kind of closure that people crave. They offer complexity, ambiguity, the uncomfortable recognition that certainty is often an illusion. White House Farm forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we determine truth. In the immediate aftermath of a crime, when information is fragmentary and emotions are running high, how do we avoid jumping to conclusions? How do we balance the need for swift action with the requirement for thorough investigation? How do we resist the institutional and social pressures that push toward premature resolution? These are not abstract questions. They have real consequences. In White House Farm, those consequences included the near exoneration of a murderer and the posthumous vilification of an innocent woman. In other cases, the consequences might be even worse. Innocent people imprisoned, guilty people freed, families denied justice, communities left without answers. The case also raises questions about the role of mental health in criminal justice. Sheila Caffel's psychiatric history was used initially to explain away the murders. It provided a convenient narrative hook, a way of making sense of senseless violence, but in doing so, it reinforced harmful stereotypes about mental illness, suggesting that people with psychiatric conditions are inherently dangerous, unpredictable, capable of sudden violence. This is, for the vast majority of people with mental health issues, profoundly untrue. They are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. But cases like White House Farm, where mental illness is invoked as an explanation for murder, contribute to a broader societal misunderstanding. They make it easier to stigmatize, easier to fear, easier to dismiss the humanity of those who are struggling. And when that narrative turns out to be false, as it did here, the damage is already done. There is also the question of media responsibility. From the very beginning, the press played a significant role in shaping public perception of the case. Early reports accepted the police narrative without much skepticism. Headlines described a troubled woman who had killed her family. Editorials discussed the tragedy of mental illness. It was only later, when doubts began to surface, when the investigation was reopened, that the media narrative shifted. Suddenly, Sheila was a victim. Jeremy was a monster. The story had been completely inverted, but the damage from the initial reporting lingered. Reputations, once destroyed, are difficult to rebuild, even posthumously. And the question remains, how much responsibility do media outlets bear for amplifying official narratives without sufficient scrutiny? How much do they contribute to the momentum that makes it difficult to change course once a story has taken hold? The financial aspect of the case, while never the sole focus of the prosecution, cannot be ignored. Jeremy Bamber stood to inherit approximately £400,000 upon the death of his parents and sister. In 1985, this was a substantial sum, life-changing money, the kind of money that could eliminate debt, fund a lifestyle, provide security for decades. The prosecution argued that this was the motive, that Jeremy had looked at his family and seen not parents, not a sister, not nephews, but obstacles between himself and wealth. That he had made a calculation, cold and brutal, weighing their lives against his financial future and deciding their lives were worth less. And this is a narrative that makes a certain kind of sense. People have killed for money throughout history, but it's also a narrative that requires believing someone could be that thoroughly devoid of empathy, that fundamentally broken in their moral architecture. The defense challenged this characterization. They pointed out that Jeremy would have inherited eventually anyway, that his parents were already in their 60s, that patience would have brought him the same outcome without risk. They argued that the timeline didn't make sense, that if Jeremy had been planning this murder for financial gain, he would have been more careful, more thorough, would have ensured that no evidence could possibly point to him. The fact that evidence did emerge, they suggested, indicated either that he was innocent or that the evidence had been planted or misinterpreted. But the prosecution had an answer for this as well. Criminals make mistakes. Even carefully planned crimes leave traces. And the fact that Jeremy had nearly gotten away with it, that the initial investigation had accepted his version of events, suggested that his plan had actually worked remarkably well. It had only failed because certain people refused to accept the convenient explanation, because they kept asking questions, because they insisted on looking more closely at the details that didn't fit. One of the most chilling aspects of the case, if the prosecution's version is to be believed, is the phone call. Jeremy called the police at approximately 3:26 in the morning, claiming that his father had just phoned him in distress. But when the police examined the phone records later, when they looked more carefully at the timing, questions emerged. Had Neville actually made that call? The records were ambiguous, and if he had, what exactly had he said? Jeremy's account was that Neville mentioned Sheila going crazy, but the phrasing itself seemed convenient, too convenient. It planted the seed of the murder-suicide theory immediately before police had even arrived at the scene. And if Neville hadn't made that call, if Jeremy had fabricated it, then that meant Jeremy had called the police to report a crime he himself had committed, playing the role of the concerned son while knowing exactly what police would find when they arrived. The psychological coldness required for such an act is difficult to comprehend, but then that's often the case with premeditated murder. It requires a kind of dissociation, a splitting of self where the person who plans and executes the crime operates in a space separate from normal human emotion. The trial itself was a spectacle, though not in a theatrical sense. It was watched closely by the legal community because of what it represented. Here was a case where the initial investigation had failed, where evidence had been overlooked or misinterpreted, where the wrong conclusion had been reached and nearly finalized. The fact that the system had eventually corrected itself was important, certainly, but the fact that it had come so close to failing completely was equally important. Legal scholars and criminologists studied the case, looking for lessons, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how similar failures could be prevented in the future. The result was a series of reforms in how murder investigations are conducted in Britain. More emphasis on preserving evidence, more skepticism about convenient narratives, more willingness to revisit initial conclusions if new information emerges. White House Farm became a teaching case used in police academies and law schools, an example of what can happen when investigative rigor is sacrificed for the sake of closure. But reforms, however well-intentioned, cannot eliminate human error. They cannot completely prevent the cognitive biases that lead investigators towards certain conclusions and away from others. They cannot eliminate the institutional pressures that make quick resolutions more desirable than thorough ones. What they can do is create systems of checks and balances, mechanisms for review, cultures that value accuracy over expediency, and in that sense, White House Farm did lead to meaningful change. Not enough to prevent all future failures, but enough to make them less likely. Enough to ensure that the questions people like Christine Eaton were asking would be taken more seriously, would be investigated more thoroughly, would not be dismissed as easily as they initially were. Jeremy Bamber remains in prison. He has now served more than 3 decades, far longer than the original minimum sentence suggested. His continued incarceration is based not just on the severity of his crimes, but on the assessment that he continues to pose a danger to society, that he has shown no remorse, that he has never acknowledged his guilt. He maintains his innocence. He has supporters, people who believe he was wrongly convicted, who point to what they see as flaws in the evidence, inconsistencies in witness testimony, reasonable doubt that should have resulted in acquittal. These supporters have organized campaigns, created websites, written books arguing for his innocence. They view him as a victim of a justice system that needed a conviction, that needed someone to blame, and that selected him because he was convenient, because his behavior after the murders made him unsympathetic, because the alternative, accepting that the murders would remain unsolved, was unacceptable. The debate continues, and perhaps it always will, because cases like White House Farm don't offer the kind of clean resolution that people crave. They offer complexity, competing narratives, evidence that can be interpreted in multiple ways, witnesses whose credibility can be questioned, motivations that seem clear to some and ambiguous to others. The jury reached a verdict. The appeals courts have upheld that verdict. The legal system has spoken. But the legal system, for all its strengths, is not infallible. It is a human institution, subject to the same limitations and biases as any other human institution. And so the debate continues, carried on by those who believe in Jeremy's innocence and those who remain convinced of his guilt, with no final resolution likely to satisfy everyone. What we are left with ultimately is a story about the nature of truth itself. Not philosophical truth, not abstract truth, but the practical, messy, contested truth that emerges from criminal investigations and legal proceedings. This kind of truth is constructed from evidence, testimony, logical inference, and human judgment. It is always provisional, always subject to revision if new information emerges, and it is always influenced by factors beyond pure logic, by institutional pressures, by media narratives, by public opinion, by the personalities and biases of the people involved. White House Farm is a case study in how this process can go wrong, how it can nearly fail, and how it can eventually, though imperfectly, arrive at something resembling justice. The victims of White House Farm deserve to be remembered not just as characters in a true crime story, but as people who lived, who had hopes and fears and relationships and futures that were stolen from them. Neville Bamber, who worked the land for decades, who built something substantial and intended to pass it on. June Bamber, who tried to live according to her principles, who worried about her children and wanted the best for them. Sheila Caffell, who struggled with demons she didn't create, who tried to be a good mother despite her challenges, who was first vilified as a murderer and then mourned as a victim. And Nicholas and Daniel, 6 years old, who never had the chance to grow up, to discover who they might become, to live the lives that should have been theirs. They are more than case file entries. They are more than evidence in a trial. They are the reason this story matters. Because when investigations fail, when convenient narratives are accepted without scrutiny, when the truth is nearly lost, it is the victims and their families who pay the price. There is a tendency, in discussing cases like this, to focus on the procedural failures, on the investigative mistakes, on the legal battles. These are important, certainly, but they should not obscure the human cost. 5 people died, a family was destroyed, a community was traumatized, and for more than a year, the wrong story was accepted as truth. That failure had consequences beyond the courtroom. It affected how people understood what had happened. It shaped how Sheila was remembered. It influenced how mental illness was discussed in relation to violence. It demonstrated once again that the systems we rely on to uncover truth and deliver justice are fragile, imperfect, and require constant vigilance to function properly. The parallels between White House Farm and other cases are worth considering. History is full of examples where investigations reached premature conclusions, where convenient explanations were accepted without sufficient scrutiny, where innocent people were blamed and guilty people escaped detection. The Birmingham Six, the Guildford Four, the case of Stefan Kisko. These are just British examples, cases where the justice system failed catastrophically, where innocent people spent years or decades in prison for crimes they didn't commit, where the real perpetrators were never caught or were caught much later. White House Farm is different in that the system eventually corrected itself before someone innocent was convicted, but it's similar in the mechanisms of failure, the pressure to resolve cases quickly, the tendency to accept narratives that fit pre-existing assumptions, the institutional resistance to admitting error. These patterns repeat because they are rooted in human psychology and institutional culture. Recognizing them, understanding how they operate, is the first step toward preventing them. Looking back at White House Farm from the perspective of decades later, what stands out is not just the crime itself, but the process by which truth was nearly lost and then recovered. It's a reminder that truth does not automatically emerge. It has to be pursued. It has to be fought for. It requires people who are willing to ask uncomfortable questions, to challenge official narratives, to insist on thoroughness even when everyone else wants to move on. Christine Eaton, who refused to accept that her cousin was a murderer. Julie Mugford, who eventually came forward despite the personal cost. The journalists who kept asking questions. The investigators who, when the case was reopened, examined the evidence with fresh eyes and recognized what had been missed. These people, collectively, prevented a miscarriage of justice. Not perfectly, not quickly, but eventually. And their efforts remind us that the pursuit of truth is not a passive process. It requires active engagement, skepticism, persistence, and courage. The question that haunts White House Farm is the simplest and most profound. What if no one had questioned the official story? What if Christine Eaton had accepted that Sheila was capable of such violence? What if Julie Mugford had remained silent? What if journalists had been satisfied with the police explanation? The answer is clear. Jeremy Bamber would have inherited the farm. He would have lived his life as a wealthy man, and the truth would have remained buried. Sheila would be remembered as a murderer. Her children would be remembered as victims of their mother's madness, and no one would have known that the real story was completely different. This proximity to failure, this sense of how fragile the truth can be, is what gives the case its power. It's a reminder that justice is not inevitable, that truth does not automatically surface, that the systems we rely on require constant attention and correction to function properly. In the end, White House Farm is not just about murder, it's about how we determine what happened when events are contested, when evidence is ambiguous, when multiple narratives compete for acceptance. It's about the danger of premature certainty, the seduction of convenient explanations, the difficulty of admitting error once a conclusion has been reached. It's about the role that money, family dynamics, and mental health play in shaping both criminal behavior and criminal investigations. It's about media responsibility, institutional accountability, and the limits of human judgment. And, most fundamentally, it's about the recognition that truth, especially in complex and contested cases, is something that has to be actively constructed through rigorous investigation, honest analysis, and a willingness to challenge one's own assumptions. The legacy of White House Farm extends beyond the specifics of the case. It has become a reference point, a shorthand for a particular kind of investigative failure. when police rush to conclusions, when evidence is overlooked, when convenient narratives are accepted without scrutiny, people invoke White House Farm as a warning. It serves as a reminder of what can go wrong, of why thoroughness matters, of why skepticism is not cynicism, but a necessary safeguard against error. The reforms that followed the case, the changes in investigative procedures and evidentiary standards, were direct responses to the failures it exposed. And while no system can be made perfect, these reforms have made similar failures less likely, have created more robust mechanisms for catching mistakes before they result in miscarriages of justice. But perhaps the most important lesson from White House Farm is the simplest: slow down. Don't rush to conclusions. Don't accept the first explanation that seems plausible. Don't allow institutional pressure or public demand to override investigative rigor. Take the time to examine evidence carefully, consider alternative theories, test assumptions, ask uncomfortable questions, be willing to admit uncertainty. These principles seem obvious, almost trivial, but they are violated constantly in criminal investigations and in countless other contexts. We want answers. We want them quickly. We want them to make sense. And in our rush to satisfy these desires, we often accept explanations that are convenient rather than accurate. White House Farm is a case study in what happens when this tendency goes unchecked, when the desire for closure overrides the commitment to truth. As we consider the case now, decades after the murders, after the trial, after the appeals and the reviews and the countless retellings, what remains is a profound sense of sadness. Sadness for the victims whose lives were stolen. Sadness for Sheila, who was first blamed and then vindicated, but only after her reputation had been destroyed. Sadness for the community of Tolleshunt Darcy, which had to live with the knowledge that such horror had occurred in their midst. And sadness for the recognition that this kind of tragedy, this kind of failure is not unique. It has happened before. It will happen again. All we can do is learn from it, try to prevent similar failures in the future, and remain vigilant against the forces that make truth so difficult to establish and so easy to lose. The final word on White House Farm will never be written. There will always be those who question the verdict, who see reasonable doubt where others see certainty. There will always be new books, new documentaries, new analyses that examine the case from different angles. The debate will continue because the case touches on fundamental questions about justice, truth, and the limits of human knowledge. But for those who have studied the evidence carefully, who have followed the case through its many twists and turns, who have examined the failures and the eventual corrections, a consensus has emerged. Jeremy Bamber murdered his family. The initial investigation failed to recognize this. The system nearly allowed him to escape justice. But eventually, through persistence and courage and a refusal to accept convenient lies, the truth emerged. Not perfectly, not completely, but sufficiently to hold someone accountable, sufficiently to provide some measure of justice for the victims, sufficiently to serve as a lesson for future investigators. And so we return to where we began. By the time White House Farm was declared a solved case, the questions had already begun. Those questions, initially dismissed as the confused grief of people unable to accept a difficult truth, turned out to be justified. They revealed that the case was not solved at all, that the accepted explanation was wrong, that the truth had been obscured by convenience and haste and institutional failure. The story of White House Farm is ultimately a story about those questions, about the people who asked them, about their refusal to accept easy answers. It's a story about how truth, when it matters most, requires not just investigation, but persistence, not just evidence, but interpretation, not just intelligence, but courage. Some truths don't surface quickly, not because they're hidden, but because they're inconvenient. They challenge accepted narratives. They require admitting error. They demand accountability. They make people uncomfortable. And so there is always resistance, always pressure to accept the convenient explanation and move on. White House Farm reminds us of the cost of giving in to that pressure. It reminds us that truth, especially difficult truth, requires vigilance. It requires people who are willing to ask uncomfortable questions and refuse to accept unsatisfying answers. It requires institutions that value accuracy over efficiency, thoroughness over speed. Most of all, it requires the recognition that certainty is often illusory, that what seems obvious may be wrong, and that the pursuit of truth is never finished. The questions never really end. They just become more refined, more focused, more difficult to dismiss. And if we're lucky, if we're diligent, if we refuse to accept convenient lies, those questions eventually lead us somewhere close to truth. Not perfect truth, not absolute truth, but something real enough to matter, something solid enough to build justice upon, something honest enough to honor the memory of those who were lost.